Welcome back to another Explainer. Today, we're unpacking a massive historical puzzle. We'll be looking at source material that explores how a thriving global economic powerhouse was systematically unmade under British colonial rule. It's a profound historical mystery, really, so let's jump right into the exact mechanics of how it all happened.
Okay, let's dive straight into this paradox. Get this. Back in the year 1700, India commanded a staggering 27% of the entire global economy. To put that into perspective, that single region generated more economic output than all of Europe combined. It wasn't just a participant in global trade, it was the absolute center of it, driving international commerce and accumulating some pretty unparalleled wealth.
But then, by 1947, when India finally gained independence, that massive 27% share had mysteriously plummeted to less than 3%. The sources we're analyzing today walk us through exactly how a dominant economic engine was dismantled in just about 200 years. I mean, how does a nation lose virtually its entire share of global wealth?
Section 1. India's pre-colonial dominance, a manufacturing juggernaut.
To really understand this collapse, we first have to look at what the Indian economy actually looked like before the 18th century. And the historical data totally shatters this modern myth of a purely agrarian, pre-industrial India. It was actually a highly advanced manufacturing hub. Indian artisans held a 25% share of the global textile trade. They were pioneers in the global steel export market, creating that highly prized Wootz or Damascus steel as early as the 6th century. And through high-end ceramics, pottery, and jewelry, they built these incredibly stable international distribution networks.
And if you want to talk about infrastructure and engineering, just look at the shipbuilding industry. It offers a really stark contrast. Bengali merchant ships, built by native artisans, using elaborate wood, iron, and brass fittings, had an average lifespan of over 20 years. Meanwhile, English merchant ships from the exact same era rarely lasted more than 12 years. It's just a clear illustration of the superior quality and durability of Indian manufacturing at the time. They were building assets that were meant to last.
Which brings us to Section 2. Dismantling native industry, the mechanics of deindustrialization. Now, the sources argue this collapse wasn't just some free market accident. It was a deliberate, perfectly structured catch-22. Step 1. British authorities established a strict legal monopoly over Indian textiles and abruptly cut off those long-standing export markets we just talked about. Step 2. Having made themselves the exclusive buyers, they stopped paying for Indian goods with foreign currency. Instead, they actually bought the goods using the very tax revenue they were already extracting from the Indian populace. So effectively, they were getting the goods for free. And finally, Step 3. To ensure British manufacturers face zero competition globally, an 80% tariff was slapped on any remaining Indian exports.
But when economic policy wasn't enough, historical accounts detail some pretty grim physical interventions. Company soldiers were sent in to smash Indian looms. Several accounts even state they went as far as breaking the thumbs of weavers so they could no longer ply their trade. These brutal tactics ensured that Indian artisans were literally physically prevented from adapting or innovating back into economic relevance.
The finality of this deindustrialization process was absolute. By 1947, a mere 0.7%, less than 1%, of India's population was employed in any form of manufacturing. A global juggernaut had successfully been reduced to nothing more than a captive market for foreign goods and an exporter of raw materials.
Moving on to Section 3, exploitative colonial taxation, the peasant trap.
So what happens when you systematically force millions of skilled artisans out of their workshops and onto agricultural land? Well, let's look at the sheer mathematical impossibility placed on these newly converted farmers. Taxes were pegged at an exorbitant 50 to 80% of a farmer's gross income. And even worse, this was calculated before the harvest even occurred. So a bad crop or a drought offered absolutely no relief. This rate was 3 times higher than taxes had ever been under native rulers, and there were 0 negotiations allowed. Cultivators frequently owed more in taxes than their land actually produced. Because strict mathematical collection was prioritized over human survival, the humanitarian consequences detailed in the sources are incredibly severe. Tax defaulters were reportedly confined in cages and exposed to the burning sun. Families were pushed to the absolute brink, sometimes forced to sell their own children just to meet the rising rates. Ultimately, when peasants couldn't pay, their farms were confiscated. And this created tens of millions of landless peasants for the first time in Indian history, fundamentally breaking the ancient agrarian structure.
Now you might be wondering, was this all just bureaucratic mismanagement and unintended byproduct of the era? Well, primary quotes show this was an explicitly acknowledged strategy. The Marquis of Salisbury, a UK Prime Minister, actually stated, "As India is to be bled of money, the lancet should be directed to those parts where the blood is congested." This reveals that the extractive nature of the colonial enterprise was openly understood and directed at the very highest levels of government.
Scholars point out a really crucial structural difference here in how India was ruled. Previous conquerors, like the Mughal Empire, were of foreign origin, sure, but they assimilated. The wealth they extracted through taxes was ultimately reinvested locally, which kept Indian economic power. The British Empire, however, operated strictly as an extractive colony. The wealth was not reinvested into local communities. It was systematically extracted and repatriated to a distant homeland in Europe.
Section 4. The infrastructure illusion. The railway myth.
Whenever this history is discussed, you'll often hear apologies point to modernization, specifically the introduction of the railways, but let's look at how the source material addresses that. Consider this staggering cost disparity. Every single mile of Indian railway cost £18,000 to construct. For comparison, the exact same mile built in the United States at that time cost just £2,000. The reason for this massive inflation? The Indian railways were essentially a taxpayer-backed guarantee for British shareholders. If revenues didn't cover the guaranteed returns, Indian taxpayers were forced to cover all the losses, which basically incentivized massive overspending and zero financial discipline.
Furthermore, the source argues that this infrastructure was functionally designed for extraction, not for the benevolent modernization of the people. The railway networks were laid out specifically to exploit inland natural resources and mass export agricultural products directly to the ports. And because all the components, the steel rails, the locomotive engines, were strictly imported from Britain, the railway project actively prevented Indians from developing their own native heavy manufacturing industries.
Finally, Section 5. The ultimate cost. Famine and extraction.
35 million. That is the source's staggering estimated number of preventable deaths that occurred due to famines over the course of British rule.
So, how do we link these massive death tolls directly to heavy-handed market manipulation? Well, during severe local droughts, there was a continuous mass export of Indian foodstuffs to Europe just to maintain trade balances. Meanwhile, the official government policy was strictly one of famine non-intervention. Journalism regarding mass starvation was actively suppressed, with historical orders given to effectively ignore the dying. And to highlight that this was policy-driven, researchers point out that there have been 0 large-scale famines in India in the 7 decades since independence.
This bleak historical reality is really captured by Dr. Charles Hall, who observed at the time, "India starves so that its annual tax revenue to England may not be diminished by $1. It's a pretty stark summary of a system where financial extraction completely superseded basic human survival.
So, what was the final financial tally of all this extraction? $43 trillion. According to modern economists cited by the source, that is the estimated present-day monetary value of the total wealth extracted from India. 43 trillion, it is a number so vast you kind of need a second just to fully grasp the sheer scale of the drain.
Which brings us to the end of today's explainer, leaving us with a really critical, provocative question to ponder. How does a 200-year, $43 trillion wealth transfer continue to shape the economic realities and power dynamics of our modern world today? It's a profound question about the lingering global aftershocks of history. Think about it. Thanks for tuning in, and keep learning.